South Dakota, December 1896. The prairie has no mercy and no memory. It simply is, flat and vast and indifferent, stretching in every direction until the eye gives up trying to find the edge. Then the blizzard comes, not gradually, not politely. In 1 hour, the world exists. In the next, nothing. 60 miles an hour, 28 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. Somewhere in the white, a man is walking. He has been walking for 2 hours. He is a surveyor. He measures things for a living. He has measured everything in this valley. He knows exactly where he is, except he doesn't. Not anymore. His compass spins. His landmarks are gone. His hands have stopped reporting to his brain. And then, through the roaring white, a shape. Low, curved, wrong. Not a tree, not a fence. Something that should not be here. Something the map says does not exist. He drives his measuring rod into it, pulls it back, looks at the tip. The mud is warm. She put her hand on the wall. That was all. Just pressed her palm flat against the curved surface of packed earth, fingers spread wide the way you'd press a hand to a child's forehead to check for fever. Except this was the opposite of fever. This was warmth without fire. Warmth without explanation. Warmth that had no right to exist at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a Dakota blizzard that was trying with genuine fury to erase the world. Outside, the wind was screaming, not howling, not whistling, screaming. The kind of sound that makes you wonder briefly and uncomfortably whether wind has feelings, whether it is angry at something specific, whether it has decided after years of patience that it has finally had enough. The temperature out there was 28 degrees below zero. Not cold, not very cold, not even dangerously cold. Just 28 degrees below zero, which is a number that stops meaning anything after a while and starts meaning everything. The kind of cold that is not a condition, but a presence. Something that sits outside your door and waits. And inside, 65 degrees. Her palm warm against warm earth. The stove in the corner burning low. A few logs, not many. Nothing like the roaring, desperate wood-eating fire that was consuming the Bower cabin 300 steps away, visible through the single small window as a faint, flickering orange panic against the white. Vasilina Koval stood in the middle of her hill and listened to the storm try to find a way in. It couldn't. She had known it wouldn't. That was the thing no one believed until they were standing inside it, and even then, even standing here in the warmth with the proof radiating through her palm, some part of her still listened for the cold to find the crack, the gap, the moment when everything she had built would reveal itself as wishful thinking. Behind her, Petro slept, 11 years old, deep asleep, the heavy, uncomplicated sleep of children who have spent the day splitting kindling and hauling water and doing the work of someone twice their age. His breathing was slow and even, not a cough, not a shiver, just breath. She had been watching him breathe for 3 days, not because she was afraid, because she needed to keep watching him breathe, to remember that she wasn't afraid. On the shelf above the small work table, the sourdough starter sat in its earthenware crock, her mother-in-law's crock, carried from Poltava in the bottom of a trunk, wrapped in 2 wool skirts and a prayer. It was bubbling quietly in the warmth, slow, steady, purposeful little bubbles, doing its work, alive. It had nearly died in the cabin, that first winter, the cabin that Mikhailo had chosen because it was already standing, because it was American, because the man at the land office had called it sound and sturdy, and Mikhailo had wanted so badly to believe him. But that was before the wall that cracked at every nailhead, before the wind that sifted through the gaps and left small drifts of snow on the floorboards by morning, before the stove that roasted you alive if you stood close and left you freezing if you stepped back. Before Petro's hands red and raw every single day of January. Before March, she went to the window. 300 steps away through the white chaos of the storm, the Bower cabin threw its anxious orange light into the dark. More light than yesterday, more fire than yesterday, which meant more wood than yesterday. And the Bowers didn't have more wood than yesterday. They were burning something else now. Furniture, maybe. The extra chairs. Ragnhild Bower was burning her kitchen chairs to keep her children alive. Vasilina knew this the way you know things about your neighbors, when you've been watching each other smoke for 6 months, the way women know things. She pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass of the window. Her fingertips fogged it. That was all. No frost, no ice forming on the inside of the pane the way it had in the cabin, the way ice had grown inch by inch until the windows went completely blind and the world outside disappeared, and you were sealed in a box of cold with nothing but the sound of your children shivering. No ice here. The glass was cold to the touch, but the air around her fingers was warm enough that the condensation stayed condensation. Didn't freeze, just fogged gently and stayed. She'd known it would work. She'd known it would work the way you know the sun will come up. Not faith, not hope, evidence, physics. The physics of a childhood spent in a village on the Poltava steppe in the shadow of her father's kilns, learning what walls were actually supposed to do. But knowing and seeing were 2 different things, and she had waited all summer, all fall, all the long month of October when the wall was finished and she moved them in, and Petro looked at the curved ceiling of packed earth and said it looked like the inside of a bread loaf. She had waited for December to prove her right, and December had arrived, with fury, with purpose, with 28 degrees below zero and 60-mile winds and 9 days of horizontal snow that had erased the horizon and the valley and the sky. December had arrived, and the wall was warm. She had been 6 years old the first time she understood fire, not in the way children understand fire, not the be careful that burns way, the other way, the older way, the way her father understood it when he pressed his hand to the side of a cooling kiln and told her what he felt wasn't just warmth. It was time, stored time, patient time. The fire had burned for 3 days and then gone out, and the kiln was holding those 3 days inside, it releasing them slowly, hour by hour, like a long exhale. His name was Boris. His hands were the color of creek clay and the texture of bark. He built kilns for potters in the villages around Kharkiv, great rounded structures of packed earth and straw and river clay, domed and thick-walled, designed to absorb heat during firing and release it slowly so the pots cooled at exactly the right rate. He had a saying. He said it in Ukrainian low and serious, the way men say things they've earned rather than learned. A good kiln doesn't hold fire. It holds the memory of fire. She had not understood it at 6. By 16, she'd helped him build 4 kilns, and she understood it the way she understood breathing. By 22, she'd married Mikhailo Koval and moved to his village and spent the next decade in the back of her mind thinking about walls, about what walls were supposed to do, because Mikhailo's family house had walls. Of course it did. Plank walls, the modern kind, the kind his mother said, were better than the old mud houses, cleaner, newer, more civilized. And every winter Vasilina stood inside those modern walls and felt the cold pressing through them like a hand pressing through paper. She thought the wall is the wrong shape, the wrong material, the wrong idea entirely. A wall is not supposed to be a barrier. A wall is supposed to be a battery. She did not say this out loud, not to Mikhailo, not to anyone. She was a woman in a village on the steppe, and she thought carefully about walls alone in the back of her mind for 22 years. She brought the sketch with her when they left, The crossing was not a story she told. Not to Petro, not to anyone. You didn't tell those stories. You put them in a box and nailed the lid down and buried the box somewhere inside you where it couldn't get out in the middle of the night. What you held on to instead were the small things. The starter, Mikhailo's mother Helena pressing the crock into Vasilina's hands on the dock at Hamburg. Old woman, small, the kind of small that means a life of hard work, not frailty. She smelled of bread and smoke. She did not cry. She just held the crock out with both hands and said, "This is older than my grandmother. Don't lose it." She hadn't. Through the crossing, through the weeks at Ellis Island, through the train across Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa, all the way to Pierre, South Dakota, where the land agent shook Mikhailo's hand and described the quarter section in Spring Creek Valley like it was paradise. The starter had traveled in a small pot kept close fed whenever conditions allowed, kept alive by attention and stubbornness and the particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It was still alive when they arrived. The cabin nearly killed it. One night in January, 6 weeks into that first winter, she'd reached for the crock at 5 in the morning and found it cold, not cool, cold as everything else in the corners of that terrible cabin. The surface had gone still, no bubbles, nothing moving. She had stood there in the pre-dawn dark with the crock in her hands and felt something shift in her chest. Not grief. Grief was for people. This was something more immediate, more animal, the feeling of watching something small and alive and entrusted to you go still. She tucked it under her arm, under her coat, against her body, kept it there all day, fed it, waited. By evening, there was a single small bubble at the surface. One bubble. She'd thought that's enough. That's enough to start from. She had been thinking the same thing about herself. Mikhailo had coughed through January, through February, through the terrible, dragging, endless gray of February in South Dakota, which is nothing like the February you imagine when someone describes winters on the prairie. It is a month with teeth. He was not a weak man. She needed to say that clearly, even to herself, even in memory. He was not a weak man. He was 49 years old, and he had crossed an ocean and staked a claim and driven fence posts into frozen ground with a sledgehammer until his hands bled. But the cabin had done something to him that the ocean hadn't. The cold inside it was not honest cold. Outside cold was what it was. You dressed for it, you respected it, you came in from it. The cold inside the cabin was a liar. It pretended to be shelter. It took the heat from the stove and diluted it and distributed it unevenly and left pockets of freezing air in every corner and damp cold along every wall and a bone-deep chill that sat in your chest whether the fire was burning or not. By March, the cough had gone down, not away, down, into his lungs, into the wet dark of them. The doctor from the county seat came once, stayed 20 minutes, said the word pneumonia without inflection, the way you say table or window, the way you say a word you've said so many times it has lost all its weight. He left instructions and a bottle of something bitter that Vasilina suspected was mostly alcohol. She had sat up 3 nights. On the 4th morning, Mikhailo opened his eyes, looked at her, and said the sketch. Where is the sketch? She had known immediately what he meant. She had gone to the trunk and found the folded paper at the bottom beneath the spare shawl and the letters from his mother and the deed to their quarter section. She brought it to him. He unfolded it with hands that shook, now hands she barely recognized, and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. She had expected many things. She had not expected what she saw. He said, "You knew this the whole time." Not a question. She hadn't answered. Because, yes, she had known. She had known since Hamburg, since the step, since her father's voice in the early morning saying things he'd earned rather than learned.
He had folded the sketch carefully and put it in her hand and closed her fingers around it. His fingers were very cold. He died 4 days later. Tallow March. Mud and cold and the particular sound of a house when the person who filled it with noise is suddenly not there. Petro, 9 years old, had gone very quiet in a way that frightened her more than crying would have. He sat beside the stove and did not ask questions. She buried Mikilo with help from the Bowers, an old Sundqvist, and a minister she'd never met who said the words quickly because the ground was still half frozen and everyone was cold. She stood at the edge of the turned earth. The sketch was in her apron pocket. She hadn't planned to bring it. It had come with her the way grief comes with you whether you invite it or not. She put her hand on her pocket. She thought not a monument, not grief, a decision. She had 3 weeks until the ground was workable. The iron came from the railhead at Pierre, corrugated iron sheets, surplus from a government contract, designed for culverts and shed roofing. She had sold the east pasture to pay for them. Not the good pasture, not the creek land, but the flat, dry east section that produced modest wheat and consumed immodest effort. The man at the railhead had looked at her across the counter for a long moment. A woman, alone, asking for corrugated iron in bulk. He hadn't said anything insulting. To his credit, he had just processed the sale with the particular blankness of a man choosing not to form opinions out loud. She had arranged transport and driven home in the spring mud with the iron rattling in the wagon bed. Olaf Sundqvist had watched her unload it from his fence line. He was 72 years old and had been farming this valley since before she was born. He had survived 14 Dakota winters. He had buried a wife and a son and kept going with the particular endurance of Scandinavian men who decide early that endurance is simply what you do. He was not unkind. He was just certain. He watched her for 3 days before he walked over, stood at the edge of what she was building, looked at the iron arches bolted together in a long semicircle 60 feet, 20 feet wide, looked at the pit she dug beside the creek where the clay was richest. He said in his careful, accented English, "The frost will crack it. When it thaws, clay expands and contracts. It will pull apart at the seams. I have seen it." She said, "Not if it's thick enough and dry enough, and not if the straw binds it." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has outlived his own certainty so many times that he no longer argues with it. He just records it. He said, "I've been wrong before." He went back to his fence line. She liked him for that, for not fighting her on it, for the humility of a man who has outlived enough of his own certainty to hold it loosely. He coughed, walking away. She heard the sound of it and added it to the list of things she needed this to work for. Eldred Quorn came on a Thursday in June, county surveyor, 61 years old, the kind of man who moved through the world like a measurement, precise, deliberate, neither warm nor cold. He carried a transit on a tripod over one shoulder and a notebook in his breast pocket, and he looked at everything as though it owed him a reckoning. He was technically there to verify a section line 300 yards north. He was clearly there to look at her structure. She watched him watch her. She was in the pit up to her knees in clay slurry, working the mixture with her feet. Petro was on the bank adding straw by the armful. Ragnhild Bauer was on the far side of the pit, doing the same thing. Her skirts hitched up her Norwegian comments about the temperature of the clay becoming increasingly colorful. Cornet set up his transit, made some notes, checked the section line, made more notes. Then he walked over. He looked at the three of them in the pit. He looked at the iron arch, half covered now in a pale gray coat of dried clay, the first layers already beginning to cure in the June sun. He looked at Vasilina. He said, "I've done the math, Mrs. Koval." He had a particular way of saying this, not aggressive, just absolute. The way a man says something
when he believes the numbers have said it first and he is merely their translator. Based on the dimensions and the density of saturated clay, you are proposing to place approximately 30 tons of earth on that frame. He paused. In the spring thaw, when the frost leaves the ground, this entire mass will become partially saturated with meltwater. The combination of that weight and the lubrication of the water in the clay matrix will cause slippage along the curved surface of the iron. The material will slump. You will be left with a bare iron shell and 30 tons of mud on your floor. He said all of this without particular pleasure. He was not crowing, he was reporting. She looked at him. She had been in the clay pit since 7 that morning. Her feet were gray, her arms were gray, her hair had a piece of straw in it. She was 48 years old, and she had crossed an ocean and buried a husband, and she was standing in a pit of mud in the middle of the Dakota prairie, being told by a man with a transit that she was doing it wrong. She said, "Have you ever slept inside a kiln?" "Mr. Quorn," he blinked. She said, "My father built kilns, potters' kilns in Ukraine. He built them the same way. River clay, straw, thick walls. The outside dried first, formed a shell, and then the sun cured the inside layer by layer until the whole thing became one piece, not clay, not straw, something else, something that didn't crack and didn't slump because it wasn't soft anymore. It was architecture." Quorn looked at the structure. She said, "The spring thaw will not touch it, because by winter it will be stone." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The physics of slump are well established." She said, "So is the physics of a kiln." He looked at her for another moment. Then he made a note in his notebook. Then he picked up his transit and walked back to the section line. Ragnhild, from across the pit, said something in Norwegian. Vasilina's Norwegian was not good, but she understood the tone. She said, "What did you say?" Ragnhild said, "I said he writes things down very carefully for a man who is going to be wrong." Vasilina looked at her. Ragnhild was 44 years old. She had come from a farm north of Bergen, where her father had been a fisherman who understood moisture and cold and the way wooden structures behaved in wet weather in ways that no formal education could have taught him. She had been in Spring Creek Valley for 8 years. She had a husband who meant well and was frequently wrong, and a son named Frederick, who was 7 and had recently discovered that rocks could be thrown in directions that were not always helpful. She had come to Vasilina 3 weeks after the clay pit opened, not to help, initially, just to watch, to stand at the edge and look. Vasilina had asked her, "What do you see?" Ragnhild had said, "I see a woman who knows what she's doing." Then she'd stood there another minute. Then she'd taken off her apron, folded it, set it on the bank, and stepped in. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't offered a speech. She'd just begun, and that was the thing about Ragnhild Bauer that Vasilina would remember for the rest of her life. The way she'd made the decision in her own body, privately, and expressed it by action, not language. They had worked in the pit together in a silence that was not empty, the kind of silence that means 2 people have decided to do the same thing and don't need to discuss it. The Reverend came in July. Vasilina had been expecting him, not this particular man, but the idea of him, the appointment of him. There are always in any community men whose job it is to name the line between the acceptable and the peculiar, and whose anxiety rises visibly when someone stands too close to that line. He was not a bad man. This was important. He was a worried man who believed that his worry was wisdom and his certainty was grace. He stood in front of the half-finished structure and he said, "There is a reason God gave us timber." She had been applying a new coat of clay, working from the bottom up, pressing and smoothing. She did not stop working. She said, "He gave us timber in Pennsylvania. He gave us clay and straw here."
The Reverend said a woman raising a child alone, taking on a project this size without a husband, without guidance. She said, I have guidance. He said, from whom? She said, from my father, who is dead, but taught me well before he was. The Reverend looked at Petro, who was hauling a bucket of clay slurry up from the creek and watching the conversation with the careful attention of a child who has learned that adults sometimes say important things when they think children aren't listening. The Reverend said, I pray you'll reconsider. She said, I'll let you know how the winter goes. He left. She watched him go with the particular calm of a woman who has been warned so many times that the warnings have stopped arriving as news. She had heard them all by then. Sundqvist at the fence line, Quorn with his transit and his 30 tons, the man at the general store in town who had declined to extend her credit for the iron bolts because he said, with genuine regret, not in the business of financing folly. The woman after Sunday service who had taken Vasilina's hand with warm concern and told her that Petro needed stability, not experiments, not mud. She had held all of these, and she had kept working. Because the thing no one understood, the thing she had no good words for in English and only partial words for in Ukrainian, was that this was not an experiment. An experiment was something you tried to see what happened. This was something she knew. It lived in her hands and her memory and the soles of her feet from all those years in her father's clay pits, learning the weight of wet earth and the sound it made when it was mixed right, and the smell of it drying in the sun. She was not guessing. She was remembering. August, September, October. The wall grew. Inch by slow inch, coat by drying coat, the iron disappeared. The structure stopped looking like construction and started looking like landscape, like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting to be noticed. By September, it was 2 feet thick. By the first frost, 30 inches. Vasilina stood back and looked at it in the October light. It did not look like a house. It looked like a hill, a low, smooth, perfectly regular hill with a stone facade at the front end and 2 small, deep-set windows set like eyes in the face of the earth. She had built her father's kiln, turned inside out. A kiln you lived inside instead of outside. The fire at the center, the mass around it, the warmth moving outward and then back, slow and patient and utterly indifferent to the opinion of Eldred Quorn. She moved them in on the 15th of October. Petro walked through the door and stopped, looked at the curved ceiling, ran one hand along the inner wall, feeling the texture of the dried clay, the straw fibers that gave it its roughness. He said it looks like the inside of bread. She said that is exactly what it is. He thought about this. Then he said, are we going to be warm? She thought about her father's hand pressing to the side of a cooling kiln, telling her what he felt wasn't just warmth, it was time, stored time, patient time. She said, we're going to be warm. She took the sourdough starter from the bag where she'd kept it during the move, set it on the shelf above the work table. The shelf was on the inner curve of the south wall, the warmest wall, the one that caught the afternoon sun through the deep window. The starter had been sluggish for days, unsettled by the cold, by the move, by whatever starters feel when they are carried from one container of air to another. She'd fed it that morning. It sat in the crock quiet. She watched it. By evening it was bubbling, not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, consistently, the way it had bubbled in Helena's kitchen in Poltava, the way it had bubbled in every warm, good-aired kitchen she had ever stood in. She put her finger over one of the bubbles, felt it pop soft and warm against her fingertip. Alive. The house was alive. November passed, cold but not cruel. She burned wood at a moderate, almost comfortable rate. The stove ate 4 or 5 logs in the morning, a few in the afternoon. By evening, the walls had absorbed enough heat that the stove could go low
and the room stayed warm, not stuffy, not dry. The thick clay breathed in a way that plank walls couldn't, absorbing moisture, releasing it slowly, keeping the air dense and even. Petro stopped complaining about cold feet. This was the clearest evidence she had. On the last day of November, Vasilina woke at 3 in the morning and lay still for a moment listening. Wind, distant but building, the particular sound that comes before weather. She got up and went to the window. The sky to the north was wrong. Not dark wrong, not storm wrong in any ordinary way. Wrong in the way that only comes once or twice in a decade. A darkness that has weight to it. A sky that is doing something deliberate. She stood at the window for a long time. Behind her the stove murmured. The walls held their warmth. The starter sat on its shelf, breathing its slow, organic breath. Petro slept without coughing. She thought about Ragnhild, about Sundqvist's lungs, about Frederick Bauer, 7 years old, who had already that fall complained twice of hands gone numb while doing chores. She thought about the orange light from the Bauer cabin window, how it would look in what was coming. She thought about Korn and his transit and his 30 tons, and the particular expression on his face when she'd asked him if he'd ever slept inside a kiln. She said nothing out loud, but she thought, come on then. Outside, the first real snow of December began to fall, and then after a moment it stopped falling sideways. That was when she knew, not snow, a blizzard, coming at 60 miles an hour from the north, carrying everything the season had in it, every degree below zero that December had been saving, every ton of ice and wind and white erasure that the Dakota prairie could make. 9 days. She didn't know that yet. Didn't know it would be 9. Didn't know that by the 4th day, Ragnhild would be burning kitchen chairs, or that Sundqvist would be struggling to breathe, or that Eldred Korn, the man with the transit and the notebook, would be somewhere out in that white fury, stumbling toward what he couldn't yet see. She only knew the wall was warm. She only knew that was enough. She stepped back from the window, added 2 logs to the stove, checked Petro's forehead. Cool. Good. She went back to bed and she slept. Day 1. The blizzard did not arrive. It detonated. There was no gradual worsening, no polite escalation. 1 hour, the sky was the usual iron gray of a Dakota December, heavy and low and unpleasant, but navigable. The next hour, the world was gone. Just gone. The snow didn't fall. It flew, horizontal, driven by 60-mile winds that turned every individual flake into something with velocity and intent. You couldn't stand in it. You couldn't breathe facing into it. You couldn't see your own hand at arm's length, which Vasilina knew because she had tried briefly before stepping back inside and closing the door with both hands against the force of the wind, trying to hold it open. She latched it, stood there with her back against the wood, listened to the storm try to find a way in. It couldn't. She knew it couldn't. She had built 30 inches of packed earth and river clay and chopped straw precisely so that it couldn't. But knowing and hearing were different things, and what she heard was a sound like the world itself coming apart at a seam, a continuous roaring shriek that had no pauses, no breath, no mercy. The walls absorbed it, not completely, not silently, but the sound that came through was different, muffled, transformed, like hearing a storm from inside a hillside, which was, of course, exactly what she was doing. She pushed off the door, checked Petro first. He was at the small table with a book, the one the schoolteacher had sent home for winter. He looked up. He said, "Is it bad?" She said, "It's weather." He accepted this, which meant he knew. Children always know. They just want you to lie to them convincingly enough that they can accept the lie and get on with their lives. She added 3 logs to the stove, not because it was cold, because warmth in reserve was warmth earned, because her father had told her You didn't wait for a kiln to cool before you fed it. You kept it fed at the margins constantly, so the mass never lost what it had. She checked the thermometer on the south wall. 64 degrees, outside 28 below zero, 92 degrees of separation between inside and outside, between survival and the alternative. She made soup. Day 2. Petra woke up hot. Not fever hot, not immediately, but wrong. The particular heat of a child whose body is fighting something it hasn't decided yet whether it will win. Vasilina put her hand to his forehead the way her mother had put a hand to hers. Cool side of the wrist, the reliable part. Hot. Not screaming hot, not the 104 that made you watch every breath, but 101 and climbing, and outside the temperature was 28 below zero, and the storm was still going, still screaming, and there was nowhere to go. This was the thing about their situation that no one talked about when they talked about the cold. Not the cold itself, the trap of it. In a crisis in summer, you could move. You could run for help. You could put a sick child in a wagon and drive to the doctor and be there in an hour. In a blizzard at 28 below zero with 60-mile winds, you were where you were. The world had one room, and that room was the room you were in, and you had to solve everything with what was in it. A sick child needs steady warmth, not roasting, not freezing, steady. She knew this from her mother, from the old knowledge of women who had tended sick children without hospitals, without the doctor who arrived in 20 minutes and fixed everything. The knowledge that had been passed hand to hand through generations like the sourdough starter, unremarkable until you needed it. Here, the temperature was 64 degrees. Steady, still, even, the same in the corner by the door as it was beside the stove, as it was where Petro lay on his cot on the far wall. The same warmth everywhere radiating from the mass of the walls, no hot spots, no cold pockets. She did not panic. This was the thing she would not explain to anyone after, the thing that sounded like cold-heartedness when she tried to put it into words. She did not panic because panic was a luxury that required the belief that the situation was beyond management. And the situation was not beyond management. The situation was a child with a fever in a warm, stable room with firewood stacked and water available and food on the shelf. She had managed worse with less. She made tea, real tea, the kind she'd been rationing, added honey from the small jar, sat beside Petro's cot and watched him sleep and listened to the storm, and kept the stove fed at the margins. Outside, through the small window, she could see nothing. Not the sky, not the ground, not the Bower cabin 300 steps away. Just white, moving white, a world that had decided for the duration to consist of nothing except cold and velocity. 300 steps away, Ragnhild Bower was burning her kitchen chairs, not metaphorically, not later, now. The ladder-back chair that had come with them from Norway, the one her mother had carried across the same ocean, Vasilina had crossed the one that had sat at the head of Ragnhild's table for 8 years. She had pulled it apart with her hands and her husband Lars's hands, and they had fed it to the stove piece by piece. The stove ate it in 40 minutes. This was the arithmetic of the frontier cabin in a real blizzard, the arithmetic that the land agents didn't mention when they sold you the promise of 160 acres, a pine board cabin with walls that had no thermal mass, required constant feeding, not regular feeding, constant, every hour, every 2 hours at most, because the heat the stove produced was air heat, convective heat, the kind that rose to the ceiling and rushed across the cold walls and fell and rushed across the floor and created a chilling draft at ankle height even when the stove was roaring. You were never actually heating the room. You were just heating the air. Repeatedly, the same air cooling and falling and rising over and over the stove, working constantly, and the walls doing nothing except conducting every BTU you produce straight back out into the -28 dark. Lars Bauer had gone out on day 1 for the woodpile and come back in 40 minutes with his beard frozen solid, a single mask of ice from his nose to his chin. He hadn't spoken when he came in. He'd just stood by the stove until his beard thawed, and then he'd looked at Ragnhild with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Afraid. Lars was not a man who was afraid of things. He was a man who fixed things, who moved through problems the way he moved through brush, steadily, with his shoulders. That expression, she had filed it away, the way women file things, the way you keep evidence of your husband's limitations, not as weapons but as information, as the map of what you will have to carry yourself. Day 2, day 3, they burned everything that wasn't structural. The extra chair, the crate that had held their good dishes on the journey, 3 boards from the barn wall that Lars pried off with a crowbar, which meant there was now a gap in the barn wall where the wind came through. Frederick was 7 years old, and his fingers had gone numb on day 1 from a trip to the outhouse. Not frostbitten, not yet, but that particular gray-white at the fingertips that meant the body had started making decisions about what it was willing to sacrifice to keep the core alive. Ragnhild had warmed his hands in her armpits, his, then her own, back and forth. All of day 2, it seemed just warming hands. She thought about the hill. She thought about Vasilina in the clay pit, in June gray up to the elbows, feet buried in the slurry, pressing and smoothing the iron arch behind her, disappearing under its coat of earth. She thought about stepping off the bank. She had not told Lars she was going to help, because Lars would do something worse than forbid it. Lars would come with her and take over, would start making decisions about angles and thickness with the confidence of a man whose primary qualification was being a man in a room. She'd gone on a Tuesday when Lars was fixing fence on the north quarter. She'd stood at the edge of the pit and watched Vasilina work for 10 minutes without speaking, and then she'd taken off her apron. She still wasn't sure exactly why, except that she was sure. In the way you are sure of things your mind can't fully articulate, but your body already knows that this woman was right, that the thing she was doing with her hands in the gray clay was a thing that mattered, and that standing on the bank watching it was a choice, and choosing to stay on the bank was a kind of cowardice she wasn't willing to wear. She'd stepped in. Vasilina had looked at her. Ragnhild had looked back. Neither of them had said anything. The decision had been made in the body, not the mouth, and it didn't require language. Now, on day 3 of the blizzard, with the kitchen chairs burning and her husband's face doing that afraid thing, Ragnhild thought about the warmth she'd felt coming off those walls, the particular quality of it, like standing near a stone that has been in the sun all day, not sharp, not immediate, just present, continuous, reliable. She thought 300 steps. She thought, I cannot walk 300 steps in this. She warmed Frederick's fingers and said nothing. Day 3. Petro's fever went to 102. Vasilina checked it with her wrist against his forehead the old way, and her wrist told her higher. Enough to notice, not enough to lose your head about. She did not lose her head. She refilled the water cup, coaxed him to drink, added another log to the stove. She made a compress from a cloth and the cold water from the pail near the door and laid it on his forehead. He looked at her with the flat, uninterested gaze of a feverish child, the one that says, I know you're doing things. I don't care. Everything is very far away. She said, you're going to be fine. He said nothing. She said, the house is warm. Your lungs are fine. It's just fever. He said in Ukrainian very quietly, I know. She stayed beside him. At some point in the afternoon, she went to the shelf and checked the starter. It was fine. Of course it was fine. The shelf temperature hadn't changed. The starter didn't care about blizzards. It cared about warmth and flour, and it had both. And it was doing its slow cellular work with complete indifference to the drama beyond the walls. She put a finger over a bubble, felt it pop, thought not for the first time, and not for the last. If the starter is working, the house is working. If the house is working, we are fine. The starter had become her instrument, her proof. She went back to Petro. Day 4. She needed more wood. This was the part she had planned for. In October, she'd stacked the wood pile against the east face of the hill under a rough lean-to roof she'd built from scrap boards, specifically for this purpose, specifically for a situation where going to the woodpile was not safe. The lean-to was attached to the hill, which meant the wood was 6 feet from the door, which meant she didn't have to go far, but she had to go outside. She tied a length of rope around her waist, tied the other end to the iron ring set into the door frame, the ring she'd installed in October, for exactly this. Then she opened the door. The blizzard hit her like a wall, not like wind, like a wall, a moving wall of cold and ice crystals and noise that struck her face and chest simultaneously and took her breath. The temperature had dropped again. She felt it in her teeth before she felt it anywhere else. She turned her back to it, could not go forward into that, could barely stand facing away from it. But the wood was 6 feet to the right along the wall. 6 feet. She had done more difficult things than walk 6 feet. She moved her hand along the outer surface, and then she felt it. She hadn't expected it, or rather, she had expected it in theory, in the way you expect things you've calculated but never experienced. She had known the thermal mass of the walls would radiate some warmth outward, but she had not felt it on her hand in -28 degrees in the middle of a blizzard. The wall was warm on the outside, not hot, not dramatically warm, but noticeably, undeniably warmer than the air around it. With her hand flat against the outer clay, she could feel it, the ghost of all the heat stored inside pressing gently back through 30 inches of earth. She stood there for just a moment in the screaming white, and she heard her father, not literally, just the shape of his voice, the cadence of it, the particular rhythm of a man who says important things quietly because he knows they're important and doesn't need volume to prove it. A good kiln doesn't hold fire. It holds the memory of fire. The wall was holding the memory of every fire she'd built since October. She found the wood pile by feel, loaded her arms, got back inside in under 2 minutes, leaned against the door. Petro from his cot, his voice raspy. "Are you okay?" she said. "I found something interesting." He said. "What?" she said. "The wall is warm on the outside." A pause. He said, "How warm?" She said, "Not very, but enough." He thought about this. Then he said, like the outside of a loaf of bread. She looked at him. 102 degrees of fever, and he was thinking about bread physics. "This child," she said exactly like that. His fever broke on day 6, day 5. Outside, somewhere between the valley and the county seat, Eldred Quarren was making the worst decision of his professional life. He had not set out to get lost. He had set out to find his survey team, 3 men, sent out on November 29th to run a section line in the upper valley. They'd been due back December 1st. It was now December 5th, which meant they'd been out for 6 days in a blizzard that had started on December 2nd and had not paused. Quarren was not a sentimental man. He was a precise man, and precisely 3 men in the field for 6 days with no shelter recorded on any map within 4 miles of their working position was a situation that required action, regardless of the conditions. He'd left on horseback, good horse, good coat, compass in the breast pocket, which he'd checked 3 times before leaving town. The blizzard took the compass on the 2nd mile, not physically took it, but the iron-rich geology of the valley played tricks on needles in good weather. In a blizzard with the static charge in the air that these storms generated, the compass needle swung and settled and swung again and could not be trusted. He'd known this. He'd relied on landmarks instead. There were no landmarks. The blizzard had removed them all. Every fence line, every tree line, every rise and dip in the terrain that he knew by memory from 14 years of surveying this county was gone beneath 4 feet of drifted snow and a curtain of horizontal white that reduced visibility to nothing. Not poor visibility, nothing. He lost the horse at mile 3. She spooked at something and threw him and ran. He heard her for 30 seconds, hooves muffled and receding, and then nothing but the wind. He stood up, in the middle of nothing, in the middle of white, in minus 28 degrees, with 60-mile winds. His transit was strapped to his back, 30 pounds of precision instrument, a tool for measuring the world, extraordinarily useful in the world, absolutely useless in this particular expression of the world, which had decided to stop having measurable features. He walked. This was the correct decision. Movement was survival. Standing still was the alternative. So he walked into what he believed was south, based on the wind direction, which was coming from the north, which he knew because everyone in Dakota knew which way the bad wind came from, except the wind had shifted. He didn't know this yet. He walked south, or what he believed was south, actually southwest. He would later calculate with his habitual precision that over the course of the next 2 hours, he had covered approximately 2 miles in the wrong direction, circling without knowing it, as the wind changed, as his judgment blurred with cold, as hypothermia began its quiet work on the edges of his thinking. He could feel it. That was the terrible thing about hypothermia. You could feel it coming, and you could not stop it. The slowdown, the weight, the way thoughts that had been sharp began to round at the edges, to arrive late, to slide away before you finished them. He kept moving, because stopping was the other thing. He had the surveyor's rod. He'd been carrying it as a walking staff, the long hickory pole with its brass tip tapping the ground ahead of him to test the depth of the snow. It was something to hold on to, something solid in a world that had gone entirely soft and white and directionally meaningless. He tapped the rod ahead of him. He walked. He stopped being afraid somewhere around hour 2. This was not courage. This was the hypothermia doing its chemical work. The fear required energy, and he was running out of energy, and the hypothermia was very efficient about stripping away the expensive processes first. He walked. He stopped walking when he ran into something. Not a fence, not a tree, something curved, something that rose out of the white in front of him as a shape that his surveyor's brain registered as anomalous. Not the right shape for this terrain, not the right curve, not a natural feature, but his survival brain registered only solid, large, out of the wind. He stopped. He stood. He thought slowly through the cold. What is this? He had been here before. He knew every feature of this valley. He had measured most of them. He knew there was nothing on this section of the survey map that should have this shape, except. He thought the word except, and then the thought slid sideways and went somewhere cold, and he stood there in the roaring white with his hand almost on the surface of the thing and not quite connecting. He lifted the surveyor's rod and drove it into the slope. This was instinct, not thought. A surveyor tests ground the way a sailor tests water, without deciding to. The rod went through the top layer of snow, 4 feet of it, with a soft resistance like pushing through flour, and then it stopped, but not with a hard stop, not with the jarring shock of a rod hitting frozen earth, the kind of stop he had felt 1,000 times on 1,000 survey lines, the clean impact of iron on hard ground. This stop was soft, thick, yielding, resistant in a way that was not the resistance of solidity, but the resistance of density, like pushing into a barrel of cold grease. The rod had not stopped, it had slowed. He pulled it back. He looked at the tip. His hand was inside the glove, was inside the frozen leather. Numb, past sensation. He brought the brass tip closer to his face, to his eyes, which were the one part of him still working properly, still reporting accurately. The tip was not coated in ice. It was coated in mud, dark, damp, the color of the clay beds in Spring Creek. He brought it closer. A thin thread of vapor rose from the brass in the -28 air, thin as breath, thin as a whisper, but there, warm. The mud was warm. He stood in the blizzard and held a warm thing, and the fog in his brain cleared, not slowly, instantly, the way a lamp comes on when someone strikes a flint, one moment dark, next moment light, because the mud was warm. Because mud didn't get warm on its own in December in South Dakota. Because 30 inches of packed earth could hold the memory of months of fire. Because there was only one structure in Spring Creek Valley made of earth and clay and straw and a corrugated iron skeleton that he had personally calculated would slump in the spring thaw, and he had been wrong. He knew he had been wrong the moment his fingers registered the warmth in the mud, the way you know a thing, not with your mind, but with your hands, which are older and more honest. The rod dropped. He didn't choose to drop it. His hands opened. The rod fell sideways into the snow. He began clawing at the surface with both hands, pulling snow away from the base of the slope where there had to be a door, because it was a house. It was a house that looked like a hill and felt like a kiln, and it had to have a door. He found the stone lintel with his right hand. He found the door with his left. He couldn't work the latch. His hands were done with fine motor activity for the day. He knocked instead, with the side of his fist. Twice. The door opened. Warmth hit him first. Before the light, before the smell, before anything his eyes could process. The warmth came out through the open doorway and struck his face and chest like something physical, like a hand pressed flat and warm against him. 60-something degrees meeting -28, and the borderland between them was the doorway, and he was standing in it. He could not move, not hypothermia, not anymore, something else. The specific paralysis of a man confronting evidence, because Vasilina was standing in the doorway. She was 48 years old, and she was wearing an apron over 2 wool skirts, and her hair was loose from where it had been pinned, and there was clay under her fingernails, because there was always clay under her fingernails. Now this was simply who she was. Behind her a lamp burned on the table. The stove glowed in the corner. The curved walls of packed earth curved overhead like the inside of something that had always existed. On the shelf above the work table, the crock, bubbling quietly, alive. On the cot against the far wall, Petro, asleep, not feverish, just asleep. Quorn stood in the doorway and said nothing. He was trying to form a sentence that contained the words "I was wrong," or "I understand now," or "I am very cold, and I would like to come inside." Any of these would have been appropriate. None of them came. Vasilina looked at him. She looked at his coat caked in ice, his beard frozen, his hands, which were the hands of a man who had been outside too long and was still trying to convince himself he was fine. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say 30 tons and it's still standing. She didn't say, "Have you ever slept inside a kiln, Mr. Quorn, because you are about to?" She opened the door wider. That was all. Just opened it wider. And Eldred Quorn County surveyor, 61 years old, a man who had measured everything in this valley and been wrong about this one specific thing, stepped inside. The warmth closed around him like a hand. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment with his eyes closed, not thinking, not calculating, just receiving, the warmth entering him the way cold had been leaving him for the last 2 hours through the skin, through the bones, through the specific cold places that live between the bones. He said finally, with his eyes still closed, how, she said 30 inches. He said the mass. She said the mass. A pause. He opened his eyes. He said the slump. She said it dried. The way I said, it's one piece now. Another pause. Longer. He was looking at the walls, at the curve of the ceiling, at the lamp on the table, and the crock on the shelf, and the sleeping child on the cot. He said your son was ill. She said fever. It broke this morning. He said, and you manage. Not a question. Not really. She heard it for what it was. A man assembling evidence, building from pieces the shape of what he'd been wrong about. Not just the physics, not just the thermal mass and the slump and the 30 inches, the whole of it. A woman in a clay pit, feet gray hair, wild pressing mud into a curve of iron while he stood on the bank with his notebook. She said, I manage. He said nothing. She said, sit down, Mr. Quorn. I'll make tea. He sat. He stayed 3 days. Not because he wanted to, because the storm kept going. Days 6, 7, 8. Outside, the world continued to not exist. Inside, the world was 64 degrees, and the smell of bread baking, and Petro's voice recovered, now asking Quorn increasingly specific questions about how land surveys were done and whether the instruments ever got it wrong. Quorn answered carefully, as he answered everything. He slept on the floor near the stove under 2 blankets. He ate what Vasilina cooked without comment. He drank the tea strong and dark, the way she made it without asking for it weaker. On the morning of day 2 of his stay, he asked if he could measure the interior wall temperature. She said, of course. He moved along the walls with the small brass thermometer from his breast pocket, pressing it flat against the earth at various heights, recording numbers in the notebook he'd kept dry inside his coat. He moved quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. Petro watched him from the cot, now sitting up, eating soup. Petro said, what does it say? Quarnet said, 61 degrees at the base, 63 mid-wall, slightly warmer near the ceiling. Petro said, which is the warmest part? Quarnet said the wall behind the stove, 66. Petro said she learned it from her father. He built kilns. Quorn looked at the wall, then at his notebook. He wrote for a long time. On the morning of day 3, Vasilina woke before the others and sat at the table with her tea and looked at the walls in the early lamplight. Quorn was awake. He was lying on his back on the floor with his eyes open looking at the curved ceiling. She waited. He said without moving, I wrote to the county extension office last spring about your structure. I expressed concerns about structural stability and advised them that the project did not merit official attention. Still quiet. He said I was incorrect. She said yes. He said I will need to correct the record, the survey map. When I file the final plat for Spring Creek Valley, I will need to note the structure accurately, and I want to add a technical notation, wall composition thickness materials, estimated thermal retention, a recommendation for replication, so that anyone who reads the map has what they need to build one. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, that's more than I asked for. He said, it's accurate. A pause. She said, what name will you put on the map? He said, whatever you want. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the walls, at the shelf, at the crock on the shelf, still bubbling, still working, still absolutely indifferent to blizzards and surveyors and 30 tons of doubt. She said, Koval structure. Kiln warm. My father built kilns. This is mine. He opened his notebook. He wrote, outside on the 9th day the wind stopped, not gradually, not with a slow diminishment the way a storm was supposed to end, just stopped, like someone turning off a sound. One moment roaring, next moment silence. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something that fills the spaces where the noise had been and has a texture and a weight. Vasilina stood at the window. The world was back, white and still and utterly transformed, sculpted into shapes and drifts that bore no relationship to the landscape she'd been looking at for 6 months. Every fence line was buried. Every familiar rise was reshaped, except the hill. Her hill sat in the middle of it, the way a real hill sits in the middle of weather, unmoved, unchanged. The snow had drifted against its sides and softened its profile and made it look, if anything, more natural than before, more inevitable, like something the valley had always contained and had only just revealed. Behind her, Quorn was putting on his coat. She turned around. He looked different from the man who had arrived at her door on day 6. He looked like a man who had been measured by something and found the experience instructive, not diminished, not humbled in the theatrical way, just adjusted, the way a good instrument adjusts when it encounters something more precise than itself. He picked up his notebook and his transit. He said, "Mrs. Koval." She said, "Mr. Quorn." He said, "The structure performed exactly as you described, as you knew it would." She said, "Yes." He said, "When other settlers see the notation on the map, they will ask about it. I will tell them to come to you." She nodded. He buttoned his coat and walked out into the silence of the 9th morning. The door closed behind him. Petro was the first one outside. Of course he was. 11 years old and 6 days of fever and 3 days of enforced convalescence had used up every particle of his capacity to stay indoors, and the moment she said the word fine, she regretted it because he was out the door before she finished saying it. She watched him from the window. He stood outside as a white stillness for a moment, just stood there with his face tilted up at a sky that had gone overnight from the featureless gray of the storm to something pale and clear and tentatively blue, like the sky was testing the idea of being blue again, like it wasn't entirely sure it was allowed. Then he ran, or tried to. The snow was up to his thighs in most places, so it was less running and more a kind of enthusiastic plunging arms out, launching himself forward, sinking, struggling up, launching again. He went maybe 20 feet in what looked like 30 seconds of maximum effort. Then he stopped, turned around, looked at the hill. She watched him look at it, the way she had looked at it from the outside herself, that first October morning, standing back and seeing the whole of it at once for the first time. The way it sat, the way it didn't call attention to itself, the way it simply was as certain and uncomplicated as topography. Then he turned around and plunged forward again toward the Bauer cabin. She let him go. Ragnhild Bauer opened the door before Petro knocked, which meant she'd been watching, which meant she'd been at the window the way Vasilina had been at the window, watching the valley return, waiting for the first person to move through it. Petro said something. Ragnhild said something back. A brief exchange, the shape of which Vasilina couldn't see from 300 steps away, but could read in the bodies, the careful posture of a child delivering information, the way Ragnhild's hand went to the door frame. Then Ragnhild looked up, straight across the white expanse between the two structures, straight to the window where Vasilina stood. They looked at each other, 300 steps of snow between them, no words possible at that distance, no gesture big enough to carry what needed carrying, just looked, and then Ragnhild nodded. One nod, specific, the kind that means something distinct and doesn't require elaboration. Not thank you, not I know, something older than both of those, something that means I see you, I see what you did, I see what it cost, and I am standing here, my children, warm enough because of it. Vasilina nodded back.
Then she went to put more wood on the stove. The first person she went to see was old Sundqvist, not because she was worried. The smoke from his chimney had been continuous throughout the blizzard, which meant he was managing, but because he was 72 and his lungs were not good, and 9 days was a long time to be alone. She waded out to his cabin mid-morning with her coat buttoned to the throat and her arms full of bread she had baked that morning. The starter was still going, had been going through the whole blizzard without interruption, and bread was what you brought when you went to check on your neighbors, because bread was warmth you could hand to someone. Sundqvist opened his door at her knock. He looked smaller, not in the way sick people look smaller, not dramatically, not dangerously, but the way a fire looks smaller when you come back to it after being away for a while, like something had burned down to its steadier level. He said, "You're all right." She said, "We're all right." He said, "The boy?" She said, "Fever broke on day 6. He's fine." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very blue for a man his age, very steady, the eyes of someone who has been watching weather for 50 years and has made his peace with most of what it does. He said, "I stood at my window on day 3 and I watched your chimney. One stovepipe, the whole 9 days. Steady smoke, never desperate, never the kind of smoke you see when someone is burning everything they have." She said nothing. He said, "I've been watching chimneys in this valley for 14 years. I know what burning too much wood looks like. I know what steady looks like." He said, "I was wrong about the structure." She said, "You were uncertain. That's different." He shook his head slowly, the specific headshake of a man refusing the easier version of a thing. He said, "No, I told you it would crack. I told you the frost would get into it. I was wrong." She held out the bread. He took it, held it with both hands, not moving to unwrap it, just holding it, feeling the warmth of it recently baked, still carrying its own version of stored heat. He said, "Your father was a kiln builder." She said, "From Kharkiv." He could tell how long a fire had been out by laying his hand on the wall. Sundqvist looked at the bread in his hands. He said, "I knew a man in Norway. Cheese caves, same idea. Thick stone, stored the cold of winter through the summer." He said the stone remembered. She said, "Yes, that's it exactly." He nodded, not the nod of witness, the nod of understanding, the nod of a man who has just placed a new piece of evidence into a framework he already had and watched the framework expand to hold it. He said, "How many other families in the valley?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "You should find out." She said, "I intend to." He coughed. Once, the familiar wet cough she'd been hearing from his fence line all fall. Then he straightened and held the bread more firmly. He said, "Come in and have tea." She came in and had tea. Ragnhild arrived that same afternoon, not for tea, not for bread, not for any of the ordinary social reasons that women visited each other's homes in Spring Creek Valley. She arrived to see the walls. Vasilina opened the door and Ragnhild walked in, and she didn't stop at the doorway. She walked straight to the nearest wall and put both hands flat against it. Both hands. Like she was checking a temperature, like she was looking for something, like she was verifying a memory she hadn't been sure she could trust. She stood like that for a full minute. Vasilina said nothing. She understood. Some information you needed to receive through your hands, through your skin, not through words or numbers or the explanations of other people. The knowledge that came through the palms was different from the knowledge that came through the ears, older and more certain, harder to argue with. Ragnhild took her hands off the wall. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but something in her face had changed, settled. The particular settling of someone who has been holding something tight for a long time and has just very carefully set it down. She said, "I told Lars you were right." Vasilina said, "What did he say?" Ragnhild said, "He said I was being sentimental." Vasilina said,
"What did you say?" Ragnhild looked at the wall, then back. She said, "I said probably, but not about the wall." And there it was, the thing that didn't have a word in English or Ukrainian or Norwegian, the specific understanding between two women who have been dismissed by the same mechanisms, who have learned to navigate the particular terrain of being correct in rooms where correct women are reclassified as emotional. Probably, but not about the wall. Vasilina laughed, not a polite laugh, not a soft laugh, a real one, the kind that comes from the chest, from somewhere below, the careful management of public behavior, the kind that surprises even the person doing it. And Ragnhild laughed, standing in the middle of the Koval Hill, surrounded by 30 inches of packed earth that had just spent 9 days keeping its promise. Two women laughed together in the lamplight. Frederick, who had come with his mother and was standing near the door with the expression of a 7-year-old boy who does not understand why adults are laughing, but suspects it is probably fine, looked at Petro. Petro shrugged. Frederick shrugged back. Some things you just accepted. The spring meeting was held at the schoolhouse on the second Tuesday in March. The valley had recovered, which was a strange word for it. Recovered implied a return to a previous state, but the valley that emerged from the snow in March was not the same valley that had gone into the blizzard in December. It was the same land, the same creek, the same section lines, but the people on it were different. You couldn't go through 9 days of that and come out unchanged. You could pretend, people did, but underneath the pretense, in the places you didn't talk about, something had shifted. Something had been shown to you that you couldn't unsee. The cold had shown everyone in Spring Creek Valley exactly what their choices were made of. Eldred Quorn arrived with his transit on his shoulder, his notebook in his breast pocket, his hat level on his head. He nodded to Vasilina at the door. She nodded back. She took a seat near the back, not the front, not conspicuously. She sat where she could see the room and be seen by it. Petro sat beside her. He had recently acquired the posture of a boy who is old enough to understand that he is at a thing that matters and young enough to not yet know how to hold that understanding without stiffening. He sat very straight. The meeting worked through the usual business: the road commission, the mill levy, the state of the eastern fence line along the county road. Then Quorn stood up. The room noticed immediately the particular attention a room pays to a person of established authority rising to speak. Not silence exactly, but a shift in the quality of sound, a tilting of attention. He stood with his notebook open. He didn't look at it. He looked at the room. He said, "I want to address the Koval structure." The room was silent. He said, "I expressed concerns last year about the structural integrity and practical utility of Mrs. Koval's building method. I expressed these concerns publicly and with confidence. I was wrong. Not I may have been mistaken. Not the evidence suggests I may have underestimated. Not the situation proved more nuanced than anticipated. Wrong. One word. Clear. Flat. Without self-pity and without performance." He said, "I was inside the structure for 3 days during the December blizzard. The interior temperature remained stable between 62 and 65 degrees throughout the event. The outer walls continued to radiate thermal energy measurably above ambient temperature even during the most severe conditions. The structural integrity was uncompromised." He said, "I took measurements. Clay wall temperature at surface 61 to 66 degrees, depending on location. Exterior temperature during peak storm, negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential approximately 90 degrees. Wood consumption during the 9-day event, less than 1 standard cord." He looked up. He said the Bauer household in a conventional plank cabin of similar footprint consumed approximately 3 cords in the same period. The room absorbed this. Lars Bauer, 3 rows ahead of Vasilina, looked at his boots. Ragnhild beside him did not look at her boots. She looked at the front of the room with the particular composure of a woman who has known something for 9 months and has been waiting for the room to catch up. Quarney said, "I have noted the structure on the final plat map as a recommended design under the name Koval structure, kiln, warm, with technical notations on materials and construction method sufficient for replication. I am recommending to anyone considering new construction in this valley that they speak to Mrs. Koval before they engage a carpenter." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, the quiet of people absorbing something. Then August Schrem, a German farmer who had been in the valley for 3 years and had spent the December blizzard burning the boards off his henhouse, said, "How thick are the walls exactly?" Ann Vasilina from the back of the room said 30 inches, river clay and wheat straw. "I'll show you the mixture." And that was that. March became April. April came in with mud and melt and the particular violence of a Dakota spring, which is nothing like any other spring because it has to undo the work of a Dakota winter, and that work is considerable. The creek ran brown and fast. The fields appeared from under their snow one dark patch at a time, tentative, not quite trusting yet that the cold was actually done. The Koval Hill sat in the middle of all of it unchanged. It did not creak when the temperature rose. It did not contract when the ground shifted. It did not develop the 1,000 small crises that plank cabins developed every spring, the nails working loose, the boards warping, the chinking, falling out of the gaps. Quarney had predicted with his calculations and his 30 tons that the thaw would be the moment of failure, that the saturated clay would slump, that the structure would reveal itself finally to be the folly the valley had always suspected. But the clay was not saturated. It had dried in the summer sun and cured over the fall and frozen into a single cohesive mass through the winter. It was not soft anymore. It was not clay anymore in the sense of something malleable, something yielding. It was what her father would have called finished, the same thing that happened to the pots inside his kilns. The clay went in soft and came out something else, something that didn't go back, something that had passed through heat and time and become a material with different properties than the material it had started as. The walls of the Koval structure had passed through a Dakota winter. They were finished. In April-August, Schrem arrived with questions. He came on a Wednesday, his wife Marta behind him, both of them wearing the particular expression of people who have spent 4 months thinking about something and have finally decided to act on it. He said, "I want to build one." Vasilina said yes. He said, "I don't know how to mix the clay." She said, "I'll teach you." Marta Schrem, who had not spoken yet, said, "How long will it take?" Vasilina said to build all summer. But the building is the easy part. The clay mixture is the thing. Marta said, "When can we start?" She said, "When the creek clay is workable. 3 weeks, maybe 4. They came back in 3 weeks with their eldest son, an August brother who had a claim 2 miles north and had also spent December burning things he shouldn't have burned, and then a Norwegian family from the upper valley, and then Gerd Halvorsen, whose wife had nearly died of a chest infection that December and who had spent the winter making a specific kind of decision about the coming one, and then others. Vasilina taught the mixture first. This was the part that couldn't be hurried and couldn't be approximated. The ratio of clay to straw, the consistency of the slurry, the way you knew it was right not by measuring but by feeling, the weight of it on the wooden float, the sound it made when you pressed a handful and released it, the specific resistance of something that would hold. She taught it with her hands, not with explanations that required translation. She showed August and Marta and their son and everyone after them what right felt like. She put their hands in the mixture and said, "Feel this, remember this. This is the thing you're looking for. And they felt it, and they remembered. Because knowledge that lives in the hands is a different kind of knowledge. It doesn't evaporate when you're nervous or cold or tired. It doesn't require language. It is there in the muscle memory, in the fingertips, in the specific learned intelligence of a body that has done something enough times to know it. Ragnhild came on a Thursday in May, not to ask how. She already knew how. She'd been in the pit since June. She knew the mixture by feel. She could have done it herself in her sleep. She came because she had an announcement. She stood at the door with her chin up and her hands not particularly still and said, "We're building one." Vasilina said Lars agreed. Ragnhild said Lars suggested it. A pause. Vasilina said he did. Ragnhild said he spent 4 days after the blizzard thawing his fingers by the stove, and apparently it was clarifying. Vasilina said how clarifying. Ragnhild said his exact words were, "We should have done this last year." Vasilina said, "That's very clarifying." Ragnhild said, "I thought so." She smiled, not the broad smile of performance, the specific contained smile of a woman who has just received in indirect form the acknowledgement she was never going to receive directly and has decided to accept the indirect version because it is what's available and it is in its way enough. Vasilina said, "Come in. I'll show you what I did differently on the south wall." They went inside. They spent 2 hours at the south wall. Vasilina showing Ragnhild the places where she'd added an extra coat. In October, the way the layers had bonded differently in the places she'd worked in direct sun versus shade. The specifics, the particular knowledge of a building you built yourself, the knowledge that lived in the hands. Ragnhild paid attention the way she always paid attention, with her whole body, with her hands on the surface as much as her ears on the words. At one point she said, "You know what I thought during the storm? Day 3. Vasilina said, "What?" She said, "I thought I could have been in there. I could have stepped off that bank in June and been in that pit and learned this thing, and my children's fingers would be fine." Vasilina said, "Your children's fingers are fine." She said this time. A beat. Vasilina said, "Yes, this time." They looked at each other. The understanding that lived between them was not comfortable. It was not the comfortable understanding of things going well. It was the other kind, the understanding that ran underneath everything, the one that said it could have been different. It nearly was. The margin between fine and not fine is often smaller than we want it to be, and we are not always standing on the right side of it for reasons we earned. She had been on the right side this time because of her father's hands, because of a sketch in a trunk, because of a decision she'd made in April to trust what she knew over what she'd been told, and because Ragnhild had stepped off a bank in June. Both things, at once, together. She said, "Come back when the creek clay is ready. I'll work the pit with you." Ragnhild said, "I know how to work a pit." She said, "I know. I want to anyway." The summer arrived, and with it a valley in the particular productive chaos of people who have decided to change something. Pit after pit along the creek bank, clay being worked, straw being mixed, iron arches going up on 3 separate claims simultaneously. At one point in July, the sound of bolts being tightened, carrying across the warm air. Vasilina moved between them, teaching, checking, correcting the mixture when someone went too heavy on the straw, showing the float technique, the bottom-up application, the way to read the drying rate by the color of the surface, explaining the why as much as the how, because she had learned from her father that people who understood why were better builders than people who only understood how. She did not charge for this. She accepted at various times a bushel of rye from August Shrem and a length of cotton batting from Marta and a day's help repairing the north fence from Lars Bauer, who arrived without announcement on a Thursday morning and worked through until the fence was done and then left without asking for tea. She thought that's his version of, I was wrong. She accepted it. She was teaching and she was learning, and the two things were the same thing, which was what her father had told her, and what she had not fully understood until she stood in someone else's clay pit and watched someone else's hands and saw them make the same adjustments she had made, the same small corrections, the same growing confidence. The knowledge was moving from her hands to other hands, from her father through her into August and Marta and Ragnhild and Gerd and all the others whose names she was still learning. The specific, unrepeatable knowledge of how to build a wall that held warmth, moving from body to body, the way sourdough moved, the way fermentation moved, the way any living thing moved. By contact, by inheritance, by the willingness of one person to put their hands into what another person had already learned. It was a Tuesday in late July. The work was done, not finished. Some of the structures were still curing, but done in the sense that her part was done. She had shown what she could show. What came after was theirs. Petro had gone to help the Shrem boy with something at the north end of the claim. She had the afternoon. The afternoon was a thing she had forgotten about. She had had since March 1896 no afternoon that was not full of something requiring her immediate physical presence. The building, the teaching, the managing of everything that had been managed before by two people and was now managed by one. The constant, excellent, purposeful busyness of a woman with too much to do and just enough energy to do it. The afternoon sat in front of her like a room she'd never been in. She went inside. She sat at the table. She looked at the walls. The afternoon light moved on them slowly. This was a thing about the hill she had not anticipated in any of her planning. How the light moved through the day, how the deep-set windows caught it and threw it across the curved surfaces in long, thin rectangles that shifted slowly as the hours passed, how the walls changed color in it. The wet clay had gone gray when dry, and then through the seasons had shifted towards something warmer, amber in the afternoon, something like the color of her father's kilns had been. She thought about him, not the sad kind of thinking about someone who is gone, the other kind, the kind where you reach for the memory and the memory is still warm because what the person gave you is still working, still producing results, still feeding forward into the world. He had been dead for 11 years, and he was here, in the walls, in the mixture, in August Shrem's hands and Ragnhild's hands and everyone's hands after that. She thought he never knew he was building this far. She thought he never knew I would cross an ocean with his knowledge in my hands and plant it in South Dakota, and that it would survive a blizzard that froze the world, and that a man with a transit would write it onto a map. She thought no one knows how far they're building. You just build. She looked at the shelf. The starter sat in its crock, still going, still working. Helena's starter, older than anyone in this valley, doing what it had always done, the slow, patient fermentation that produced in the end bread, warmth you could hand to someone. It was bubbling gently in the afternoon light. She watched it. She thought about Mikhailo in that last week, his hands shaking, the sketch, the way he'd folded it and pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. She thought he wasn't giving it back to her. He knew it had always been hers. She thought he was just finally saying so. The thought did not hurt exactly. It was not painless either. It was the specific bittersweet ache of understanding something too late to share with the person you'd most want to share it with. The knowledge that arrives after the conversation is no longer possible. She held it. She did not hurry it away. Outside, she heard Petro's voice. Far off at the north end of the claim, he was saying something, laughing at something. The particular laugh of a boy who had decided the world was interesting and hilarious and full of problems worth solving. His father's laugh, the shape of it. She stood up from the table and went to the shelf and fed the starter, flour and water, the usual measure, the daily ritual, the thing that kept living things alive. Attention, regularity, the willingness to show up each day with what was needed and give it. Through the window, Petro appeared, running across the field toward the hill, his arms out the way. Children run when they're running because running is the right speed for the moment and not because they're going anywhere in particular. He burst in the door. He said out of breath, "Mama?" The Shrem boy said his father is putting up the iron frame tomorrow. "Can I go help?" She looked at him, 11 years old, his father's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness, and she thought now his grandfather's hands, the way he held things, the way he tested surfaces. She said, "Yes, go, but come back by evening." He said, "I will." He was already half out the door. He stopped, turned back. He said, "Mama, what are we gonna build next?" She looked at the walls. She looked at the starter fed and settled, beginning already its slow new work. She thought about the valley, about the pit at the Shrem claim, about the upper valley families who hadn't come yet but would come, about the knowledge moving from hand to hand to hand. She said the same thing your grandfather built, and his grandfather before him. He waited. She said a hill that holds the summer inside it. He thought about this. Then he nodded, the nod of a child who doesn't fully understand something yet, but has decided to trust it, which is the beginning of understanding, which is in fact the only beginning there is. He ran back out into the July afternoon. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the room, to the amber walls, to the bubbling crock on the shelf, to the afternoon light moving slowly across everything her father had taught her, and everything she had built from it, and everything that would keep moving forward from hand to hand long after she was gone. She let herself be still.